Transfer all corporate and personal assets to a humble waitress. The moment the lawyer finished reading the final clause, the legal tower of Manhattan's biggest conglomerate froze in absolute disbelief. Everyone thought billionaire mogul William Carter had lost his mind when he signed this fate-altering will. They couldn't comprehend why a $4.7 billion empire was handed over to a young woman who had never stepped foot in high society, a woman he had met exactly one time in his life. But they didn't know that behind a simple $2 cup of coffee, served in the pouring rain, lay a heart-wrenching secret that would rewrite the meaning of wealth and human dignity forever. You are about to witness an unforgettable journey of silent sacrifice and staggering destiny, where a single act of unconditional kindness completely revalued a billionaire's legacy. The last thing the lawyer said before silence swallowed the room was not a question, but a warning. This will change everything. Outside the glass walls of the Manhattan legal tower, the city moved like it always did, fast, indifferent, and glowing with millions of untold stories. But inside, time felt like it had been folded in half. William Carter sat motionless in a black leather chair that cost more than most people's monthly rent, his hands resting calmly on a polished oak table where documents worth $4.7 billion were spread out like a map of a life about to end. No one in the room spoke at first, not the attorneys in tailored suits, not the estate executor clutching a pen like it weighed 1,000 pounds. Not even the family members seated rigidly along the side wall who had come expecting certainty but found only confusion. Because on the final page, where every signature should have reinforced legacy, there was only one name that mattered. Not a board member, not a child, not a spouse, a waitress, Emily Dawson, a woman William Carter had met exactly one time. 72 hours earlier, she had been standing behind a corner booth at a small downtown diner in Lower Manhattan, balancing a tray in one hand and a receipt pad in the other, when a man who had spent his entire life building empires walked in without security, without announcement, without anything that suggested he was worth more than the coffee he ordered. It had been raining that night, the kind of cold New York rain that clings to taxi windows and reflects neon signs in fractured colors, and William had looked less like a billionaire and more like a man who had forgotten where he was going. Emily had not asked questions. She had not studied him. She had simply served him a hot cup of coffee, placed it down with steady hands, and said, "Refill anytime, sir," the same way she would have said it to anyone else sitting in that booth. That was it. No recognition. No performance. No adjustment in tone when he didn't respond like a man used to being recognized. And for William Carter, that absence of reaction was louder than any applause he had ever received in his life. Back in the present, the lawyer cleared his throat, struggling to maintain professional composure as he read the clause again, as if repetition might change its meaning. All personal and corporate holdings, including Carter Holdings' majority assets, are to be transferred in full to Emily Dawson, effective immediately upon verification of identity. A soft inhale moved through the room like a ripple through still water. Someone shifted in their seat. Someone else whispered a name under their breath like it might explain everything. But William did not move. His expression remained unreadable, not because he felt nothing, but because what he felt could not be easily named. The truth was, no one in that room understood what had happened in that diner 3 nights ago. Not the lawyers, not the family, not even Emily herself, who was likely still working double shifts, unaware that her life had already been rewritten in ink she had never seen. Because that night had not been about coffee, or rain, or coincidence. It had been about something William Carter had spent decades losing without realizing it. The ability to be seen without being judged. And in the quiet of that small diner booth, for the first time in years, someone had looked at him not as a billionaire, not as a symbol, not as a legacy, but simply as a man sitting alone in the rain. And that was the moment everything began to change. By the time the sun rose higher over Manhattan, the decision that had been signed into legal existence the night before had already begun to behave like a force the room could no longer contain. In the glass tower where William Carter's legal team continued their discussions, the atmosphere had shifted from confusion into something closer to disbelief, wearing the mask of professionalism. Every document had been verified at least twice, every signature confirmed, every clause cross-checked, Yet the conclusion remained unchanged. The entirety of Carter Holdings, along with private estates, investment portfolios, and controlling shares across multiple international subsidiaries, had been assigned to a single individual with no prior financial connection to the empire. Emily Dawson. The name now repeated in legal conversations like a question no one could properly frame. William Carter himself had not changed his answer since the night before. He remained calm, almost detached, as if the outcome had already been decided long before ink touched paper. When pressed again by his most trusted advisor, a man who had spent 20 years protecting his interests across volatile markets, William simply replied that what had been done was not about logic in the way they understood it, and that not everything meaningful in life could be measured in returns or risk assessments. Meanwhile, across the city, Emily's day continued in complete contrast to the world quietly shifting above her. She worked through her morning shift at the diner on East 45th Street, unaware that her name was now being spoken in boardrooms she had never entered. She moved between tables with the same steady rhythm she always had, refilling coffee cups, checking orders, and offering polite smiles that carried no expectation of recognition beyond the moment itself. To her, nothing had changed since the night she served the quiet man in the rain. She remembered him vaguely now, not as someone important, but as someone who had looked tired in a way she understood too well, the kind of exhaustion that comes from carrying things that cannot be easily explained. What she did not know was that the legal verification process had escalated beyond routine review. By midday, representatives from Carter Holdings had begun discreet inquiries into her background, not out of suspicion, but out of necessity to understand a decision that defied every structural expectation they had ever known. The findings only deepened the mystery. Emily Dawson lived modestly in a small apartment, worked multiple shifts, and had no recorded contact with anyone from Carter Holdings or its subsidiaries. There were no financial ties, no strategic advantage, no public interaction that could explain the magnitude of the transfer. It was, by all conventional standards, irrational. Yet William Carter refused to intervene or clarify beyond his original instruction. Later that afternoon, he returned once again to the diner, sitting alone in the same booth as before. This time, he did not order immediately. Instead, he observed quietly as the world around him continued its ordinary rhythm. Plates were delivered, conversations rose and fell, and the staff moved with practiced efficiency that rarely noticed the individuals who passed through their space. When Emily eventually approached his table, she greeted him with the same polite professionalism she offered every customer. There was no recognition in her expression, no sign that she understood the magnitude of the moment unfolding just beneath the surface of her ordinary routine. William looked at her for a long moment before speaking, noting the calmness in her presence, the absence of performance, the kind of sincerity that does not adjust itself based on who is watching. He asked her a simple question about her day, and she answered without hesitation, mentioning small challenges, long hours, and the quiet determination to keep moving forward despite uncertainty. In that exchange, brief and unremarkable to anyone else in the room, William saw something he had not encountered in years. Not admiration, not fear, not calculation, but presence without condition. And for reasons he himself would not fully articulate even if asked, that had become more valuable to him than everything he had built. As the afternoon light shifted across Manhattan, casting long reflections through the glass facades of towering buildings, the distance between two worlds continued to grow in silence. On one side of the city, executives and legal advisors were still attempting to reconstruct logic from what had already been decided. On the other side, Emily Dawson was finishing her shift at the diner, unaware that her name had become the center of discussions she could never overhear. The only change she noticed that day was a subtle tension in the way some co-workers spoke to her manager, as if something unseen had altered the air without explanation. She brushed it off, assuming it was just another busy day in a city that rarely paused for anyone. Meanwhile, William Carter remained in motion, but not in the way others expected. He was not issuing corrections or revising instructions. Instead, he was observing. That evening, he returned again to the diner, arriving earlier than before, choosing the same booth near the window where streetlights began to glow as dusk approached. He did not bring company, nor did he request privacy. He simply sat, as if waiting for something that could not be scheduled or predicted. When Emily approached his table, she greeted him with the same calm professionalism, placing a glass of water in front of him before asking if he was ready to order. William paused longer than usual before responding, his attention not on the menu, but on the way she carried herself without expectation of importance. He asked her about her plans after work, a question so ordinary that it almost felt out of place in his world. Emily replied with honesty, mentioning her second job across town and the need to pick up medication for her mother later that night. There was no complaint in her voice, only acceptance of routine responsibility. William listened without interruption, and for the first time in years, he found himself paying attention not to outcomes or transactions, but to the structure of a life built entirely outside his influence. Across the room, the diner continued its usual rhythm, unaware that a conversation taking place in a corner booth was carrying more weight than the financial decisions being debated in boardrooms uptown. Emily eventually excused herself to attend to another table, but William remained still, watching the space she had just occupied as if something fundamental had shifted in its absence. Later that night, after the diner had grown quieter and the final rush had passed, Emily returned to clear his table. This time, William spoke without hesitation, asking her what she would do if she no longer had to work multiple jobs just to maintain stability. The question was not delivered with arrogance or assumption, but with a kind of cautious sincerity that made it feel unfamiliar in that setting. Emily stopped briefly, considering it not as fantasy, but as something distant and impractical. She said she would likely study further, maybe nursing or social work, something that would allow her to help people in a more direct way. Her answer was simple, grounded, and free of ambition shaped by wealth. William nodded slowly, as if confirming something he had already begun to understand. He did not respond immediately, allowing the silence between them to settle naturally, filled only by the distant sound of dishes and quiet conversations fading toward closing time. In that silence, William Carter appeared less like a man who commanded vast resources and more like someone measuring a decision that could not be reversed once spoken aloud. And for Emily, the interaction remained nothing more than an unusual conversation with a quiet customer, unaware that every word she had spoken was being carried forward into a future she had not yet been told she had already entered. By the time night settled fully over Manhattan, the city no longer felt like a place divided by wealth, but like a place quietly waiting for something it could not yet name. In the legal tower, the final confirmation reports had been completed, stamped, and filed, yet none of the people involved seemed satisfied with the idea that paperwork alone could define what had been set in motion. Even the most experienced advisors found themselves returning to the same conclusion repeatedly, not because it changed, but because their understanding refused to accept its finality. William Carter had already left the building hours earlier without explanation, declining transportation and choosing instead to walk alone through the streets where reflections of neon lights stretched across wet pavement like fragmented memories. He moved without urgency, passing crowds that did not recognize him, and for the first time in years, he did not feel the weight of being observed. Meanwhile, Emily Dawson was ending her second shift at a small late-night cafe a few blocks away from the diner, unaware that her life had already been rewritten in a system she would not see until it chose to reveal itself. She moved with quiet exhaustion, folding aprons, wiping counters, and exchanging polite goodnights with coworkers who shared the same routine shaped by necessity rather than choice. Her thoughts were simple, centered on the bus ride home, the short sleep she would get before starting again, and the responsibility waiting for her mother who depended on her stability. There was nothing in her world that suggested anything extraordinary had occurred or was about to occur. It was shortly after midnight when William arrived again at the edge of her routine, this time waiting outside the cafe instead of inside, standing beneath a dim streetlight that flickered intermittently as traffic passed. When Emily finally stepped out, she almost did not notice him at first, until he spoke her name softly, without authority or expectation. She stopped, slightly confused, recognizing him as the quiet man from the diner, but unaware of anything that had changed between them. William did not immediately explain. Instead, he simply asked if she had a moment to walk with him, And after a brief hesitation shaped more by fatigue than curiosity, she agreed. They walked slowly through streets that were beginning to empty, the sound of the city softening into distance as they moved further from the bright intersections. William spoke carefully, choosing words that did not belong to the language of business or law, but to something more fragile and uncertain. He told her that decisions had been made involving her name, decisions she had not been consulted on and could not yet fully understand. Emily listened without interruption, her expression shifting gradually from confusion to disbelief, and then to a quiet attempt to process something that did not align with anything she had ever imagined possible. She asked him why, not in anger, but in genuine inability to comprehend how such a thing could involve her at all. William stopped walking for a moment, looking out at the empty street before answering. He said that sometimes a single moment, however small, reveals more about a person than years of observation in places where everyone is trying to be seen. He did not mention wealth or inheritance directly, nor did he attempt to justify it in terms of logic that would satisfy anyone else. Instead, he described the feeling of being treated without calculation, of being acknowledged without condition, and of being allowed to exist without being measured. Emily stood quietly as he spoke, the weight of his words settling around her in a way that felt unreal, as if the night itself had shifted slightly off balance. And as the wind moved through the empty street between them, William Carter finally understood that what he had set in motion was not a transaction of fortune, but a transfer of meaning that neither law nor expectation could fully contain once it had begun to unfold. The silence between them stretched longer than either of them seemed prepared to fill as they stood beneath the dim streetlight on the nearly empty Manhattan street. The city around them continued its distant rhythm, taxis passing in occasional bursts of yellow light, a subway rumbling faintly beneath the ground like a hidden current, but none of it seemed to reach the space where William Carter and Emily Dawson now stood suspended in an unspoken tension. Emily finally broke her gaze, looking down at her hands as if trying to anchor herself to something familiar, something that still made sense. She asked again, more softly this time, what he meant when he said decisions had already been made involving her name. William hesitated, not because he lacked clarity, but because the explanation itself felt inadequate compared to the weight of what had already been signed into reality. He told her that her identity had been attached to legal instructions that extended far beyond anything she could have imagined, and that those instructions had been executed under his full authority. Emily shook her head slightly, not in disbelief at him personally, but in disbelief at the idea that her life could be spoken about in such terms, as if she were part of a structure she had never entered willingly. She asked him why her, and the question carried no accusation, only confusion rooted in the quiet honesty of someone who had never expected to be the center of anything beyond her own responsibilities. William looked at her for a long moment before responding, and when he did, his voice carried a calmness that felt heavier than explanation. He said that most people he had encountered throughout his life saw value through position, through influence, or through advantage, but that she had not done so, even when she had every reason to treat him differently. He recalled the diner, the rain against the window, the absence of recognition in her voice, and the simplicity of her actions that required nothing in return. Emily listened without interruption, though the meaning of his words began to settle into her slowly, like something too large to fully comprehend at once. She reminded him that she had only done what anyone should do, that there was nothing extraordinary in serving someone a meal or speaking politely to a stranger. But William gently disagreed, explaining that in his experience, what people considered ordinary was often shaped by expectation rather than choice, and that true absence of calculation was far rarer than generosity itself. As they continued walking, the city grew quieter, the streets narrower, and the light from surrounding buildings softened into distant reflections. Emily spoke about her mother, about the second job she would return to in a few hours, and about the constant pressure of maintaining stability in a life that never paused long enough to feel secure. William listened without interruption, absorbing details that carried no financial value, yet seemed to affect him more directly than any report or acquisition ever had. At one point, they stopped near a crosswalk where the signal flickered between red and green, and William finally admitted that what he had done was not an attempt to reward her, but an attempt to correct something he could no longer ignore within himself. Emily turned slightly toward him, her expression still uncertain, but now marked with a quiet realization that whatever had begun in her life was no longer confined to explanation. It had already moved beyond her control, not as punishment or gift, but as something that had been set in motion long before she understood she was part of it. By the time the first light of dawn began to touch the edges of Manhattan, the conversation that had taken place hours earlier still lingered in Emily Dawson's mind like a question without a clear place to rest. She had returned home after the walk in silence, her steps slow, her thoughts heavier than fatigue itself, and now she sat at the edge of her small kitchen table with a cup of untouched coffee growing cold in her hands. The apartment around her remained unchanged, the faint hum of the refrigerator, the worn edges of furniture she had saved for piece by piece, the quiet reminders of a life built on repetition and endurance. Yet something inside her felt unsettled in a way she could not fully articulate. William Carter's words kept returning to her, not as threats or promises, but as something closer to an explanation she had not asked for and did not know how to accept. Meanwhile, across the city, William stood alone once again in his private office overlooking the skyline, the city stretching endlessly beneath him like a system he had once believed he fully understood. But now, even that perspective felt incomplete. He reviewed nothing on his desk, made no calls, and issued no instructions. Instead, he simply observed the horizon, as if searching for something that could not be measured in reports or financial summaries. For the first time in years, he was not thinking in terms of expansion or control, but in terms of consequence. Later that morning, legal representatives arrived at Emily's apartment building under the guise of formal verification, carrying documents that required signatures she did not yet fully comprehend. When they knocked on her door, Emily hesitated before opening it, expecting perhaps a mistake or confusion, but instead she was met with calm professionalism and language that immediately felt too heavy for her daily reality. They explained carefully that certain legal provisions had been enacted in her name, and that those provisions required acknowledgement in order to proceed. Emily listened in silence, her expression shifting gradually from confusion to disbelief, as the reality of what William had described began to take form outside of his words. She asked them directly if there had been some misunderstanding, if perhaps her identity had been confused with someone else, but the representatives confirmed her name with absolute certainty. Each confirmation only made the situation feel further removed from anything she had ever experienced. After they left, Emily remained standing near her apartment door for several minutes without moving, the documents still resting in her hands like objects that belonged to a different world. She eventually sat down again, placing them carefully on the table, as if even touching them too directly might make them more real than she was prepared for. Her thoughts turned back to William, to the quiet way he had spoken the night before, and to the absence of any demand in his voice, as if what he had done was not an act directed at her, but something he needed to complete within himself. That same afternoon, William requested to meet her again, not in a boardroom or legal office, but in the same diner where their first encounter had taken place. When Emily arrived, she found him already seated in the corner booth, the same position he had chosen before, as if continuity of place might help stabilize something that no longer felt stable. She sat across from him slowly, unsure of what role she was expected to play in a situation that no longer resembled any version of normal conversation she had ever known. William did not begin with explanation this time. Instead, he simply acknowledged that the legal process had moved forward and that there was no longer a way to reverse what had been initiated without dismissing the intention behind it entirely. Emily looked down at the table for a moment before asking him, quietly, what he expected from her now. William paused, and for the first time, his answer carried no structure of business or logic. He said that he expected nothing in the way she assumed, because what had driven his decision was never about expectation at all. It was about recognition, and about a moment that had revealed something he had spent years forgetting. As they sat there in the fading afternoon light, neither of them spoke for a while, and in that silence, the distance between their worlds did not disappear, but it began, for the first time, to feel acknowledged rather than ignored. The next morning arrived in Manhattan with a pale gray light that seemed to soften everything it touched, as if the city itself was hesitating before fully waking up. Emily Dawson stood inside the diner again, moving through her shift with the same familiar rhythm, yet her awareness of the world around her had changed in ways she could not fully explain. Every sound felt slightly closer. Every conversation at nearby tables carried a faint sense of weight, as if something unseen had shifted the structure of her reality without altering its appearance. She still wore the same uniform, still carried the same trays, still greeted customers with the same polite tone, but inside her thoughts kept returning to the conversation from the day before, the quiet certainty in William Carter's voice, and the way he had spoken about recognition rather than reward. Across the city, William Carter remained in his private residence for most of the morning, refusing calls and declining meetings that would normally define his schedule. Instead, he reviewed nothing, signed nothing, and instructed no one. For a man who had once measured his life in transactions and outcomes, this stillness was unfamiliar, almost uncomfortable, yet he did not break it. Later that afternoon, Emily received another visit from legal representatives, this time with more structured documentation and clearer language that confirmed the irreversible nature of the arrangements already placed in motion. She read slowly, pausing frequently, her eyes returning to the same lines as if repetition might reveal a different meaning. But each return only reinforced the same conclusion. What had begun as an encounter in a diner had expanded into something that now extended far beyond her control or understanding. After the representatives left, she remained seated at her small kitchen table, the documents spread out in front of her like objects belonging to a life she had not yet learned how to live. She did not cry, nor did she speak aloud, but the silence around her felt denser than before, filled with questions that did not have immediate answers. Meanwhile, William requested one final meeting that evening, again choosing the diner as the location, as if returning to the origin of something might help bring clarity to its consequences. When Emily arrived, she found him already seated in the same booth near the window, the fading daylight casting long reflections across the table between them. She sat down slowly, her movements careful, as though any sudden motion might disrupt the fragile balance of understanding that had begun to form. William looked at her for a moment before speaking, and when he did, his voice carried less of explanation and more of reflection. He told her that throughout his life, he had learned to evaluate people through patterns, performance, and predictability, but that none of those methods had ever accounted for the kind of presence she had shown without effort or awareness. Emily listened without interruption, though her expression carried a mixture of uncertainty and quiet fatigue, as if she were still trying to find the point where this version of reality connected to the one she had always known. She finally asked him what would happen next, not in terms of legal process, but in terms of her life. William paused before answering, and when he did, his response was no longer about decisions already made, but about what she might choose to do with something she never asked for. He said that nothing about her future had to be defined by his actions, even if the world around them would try to interpret it that way. The words settled between them, not as instruction or obligation, but as acknowledgement that the meaning of what had happened could not be controlled by either of them alone. Outside the diner, the city continued its steady movement, unaware of the quiet transformation unfolding in a corner booth where two lives, separated by everything measurable, were now connected by something neither of them had fully named. The final evening of their meetings arrived without announcement, as if the city itself had decided not to mark the moment with anything as simple as a signal or a sign. Manhattan moved in its usual rhythm outside the diner, headlights stretching across wet pavement, distant conversations dissolving into the hum of traffic. Yet inside the corner booth where William Carter and Emily Dawson now sat for the last time, everything felt quieter than it had ever been before. Emily placed her hands gently on the table, no longer reading documents, no longer searching for explanations in language that seemed too large for her daily life, and William sat across from her with an expression that no longer carried the weight of decision, but something closer to acceptance. For several seconds neither of them spoke, not because there was nothing left to say, but because anything spoken now would feel smaller than what had already occurred between them. William finally broke the silence. not with instructions or clarification, but with a simple acknowledgement that what had begun in confusion had reached its natural conclusion, not in law, but in understanding. He told her that nothing about what he had done was meant to remove her from her life, nor to replace it with something unfamiliar, but rather to place in her hands a possibility she had never been given the space to imagine. Emily listened carefully, her gaze steady but softened by exhaustion, as if the weight of the past days had slowly settled into something she could no longer resist carrying. She asked him quietly what he expected her to do now, not in terms of obligation, but in terms of direction, and William paused for a long moment before answering, his attention shifting briefly toward the window where the city continued to move without awareness of their conversation. He said that for most of his life, he had believed that legacy was defined by structures that outlasted individuals, but that he had come to understand something different in the short time he had known her. That legacy could also exist in the absence of control, in the decision to allow someone else to define what comes next. Emily lowered her eyes for a moment, absorbing his words without interruption, and when she spoke again, her voice carried less confusion than before, replaced instead by a quiet clarity shaped by everything she had experienced in recent days. She told him that she did not know what kind of future belonged to her now, but that she knew she could not return to believing she was invisible within it. William nodded slowly, as if that statement alone confirmed everything he had been uncertain about. He then reached into the inner pocket of his coat and placed a single folded document on the table, not as a continuation of authority, but as a final act of release. He explained that all legal matters would now proceed independently of his involvement, and that whatever decisions followed would belong entirely to her. Emily did not touch the document immediately. Instead, she looked at it for a long moment, then back at him, as if trying to understand not the value written within it, but the distance it represented between who she had been and who she might become. William stood slowly, adjusting his coat without urgency, and for the first time since their meeting began, there was no sense that anything remained unresolved. Before leaving, he simply said that what mattered most was not what had been given, but what she would choose to recognize within herself moving forward. Emily remained seated long after he had left the diner, the quiet around her no longer feeling empty, but filled with the unfamiliar shape of possibility. Outside, the city continued its endless motion, unaware that in a small corner booth, a life that had once been defined by limitation had quietly crossed into something that no longer belonged to the world it came from, but entirely to the person who now had the freedom to decide what it would become. Money can build towering glass skyscrapers in Manhattan, but it can never purchase a genuine look free of calculation. Emily Dawson didn't step into a powerful future because she tried to impress a billionaire. She inherited it because she kept her humanity intact when serving a quiet stranger in the dark. William Carter found redemption for his lonely soul, and Emily finally found the freedom to define her own worth. But this is only one layer of what happens when massive wealth collides with pure human connection. If you believe that silent integrity and unconditional kindness should always win the ultimate prize, hit that subscribe button right now and turn on all notifications. Don't stop watching. The next breathtaking story of hidden wealth and a shocking boardroom awakening is already playing on your screen right now. Click on it immediately, because you won't believe what happens when another reclusive billionaire goes undercover to find his true heir. See you in the next video.